Hello there. Chaos, strikes, resignations, and a deceased monarch. 2022 was not a good year for Britain. Will Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's government succeed in halting relegation, though? Well, Great Britain is in a crisis. The Prime Minister, once hugely popular with voters, is stuck in the polls. He takes refuge in right wing populist projects and sticks to the phrases about the alleged advantages of Brexit. The ruling Tories, once a broad mainstream party, are caught in the clutches of their right wing fringe and plummeting in polls. And one political scandal follows the next. And meanwhile, the economic consequences of leaving the EU are having an increasing impact. The description dates from spring 2022. The ailing Prime Minister is Boris Johnson. But it also applies to the present. Rishi Sunak, the third Tory Prime Minister of the year, apparently has little to counter the country's numerous problems. But let's have a look at the year, and we start in January. The first day of the year already acts as a harbinger of some of the year's developments. January 1st in 2022 is the warmest New Year's Day on record. In the same month, inflation suddenly shoots to a 30-year high. Prime Minister Boris Johnson is already preoccupied with clinging to his post. For weeks, details have emerged of illegal parties being held at Downing Street by government officials while the country was in lockdown. Demands for resignation are getting louder and louder. An official investigation led by senior official Sue Gray is expected to clarify what the allegations are about. It quickly becomes clear that Johnson wants to sit out the scandal. He launches one right-wing populist smokescreen after the other. Johnson clearly wants to appease the influential right-wing fringe of his party and the Tory voters. And then we have February. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in February is also dominating the headlines in Great Britain. Johnson apparently sees the tragic developments as an opportunity to distract from his scandals. London demonstratively assumes a leading role in the West's response. After decades of an open-door policy for the Russian super-rich, for the first time London has credibly cracked down on Russian ruler Vladimir Putin's confidants and imposed sanctions on hundreds of people. After all, some of the wealthiest Russian oligarchs reside in real castles in London. The war is driving up already high energy prices, and inflation in Great Britain is accelerating. Within a week, 3 storms cause severe damage, which is kind of a metaphor for the government. And then we have March. The economic upheavals resulting from the energy crisis are becoming increasingly noticeable. Great Britain consumes very little Russian gas. However, since the country has given up most of its gas storage facilities in recent years, the massively increased prices are hitting the country particularly hard. And then all eyes are on Chancellor of the Exchequer Rishi Sunak. After all, the ex-banker has given the British and companies in the country a lot of help during the lockdowns. This made him the most popular politician in the country for a long time. But Sunak's spring budget is a flop. It lowers taxes on fuel by 5 pence per litre. The municipalities receive emergency funds, and VAT on solar cells, house insulation and the like is eliminated. And that was about it. It's dawning on more and more Britons that the heavily wealthy Sunak, the overwhelming bulk of his wealth comes from his wife, whose father is an Indian IT billionaire, may not really have the down-to-earth attitude that would enable him to understand the concerns of ordinary people. London is now also imposing sanctions on the super oligarch Roman Abramovich. As a result, he's no longer even allowed to have his luxury properties in London cleaned. And then we have April. Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey warns Britain is facing its worst energy crisis since the 1970s. The energy price cap, which is intended to ensure that households are not cheated by energy providers, will be raised by 54% in one fell swoop. This means that a typical household has energy costs of £1,971 per year, and the trend is rising. Prime Minister Boris Johnson is also increasingly in trouble. More and more details about Johnson's long-time friendship with Yevgeny Lebedev are coming to light. In his early 40s, the son of a former KGB spy and oligarch, he has lived in the UK since childhood. Lebedev is the owner of the daily newspapers The Independent and Evening Standard and the TV channel London Live. In 2020, at Johnson's urging, he was knighted and given a seat in the House of Lords, the upper house of the British Parliament. His title is Baron Lebedev of Hampton and Siberia. British media reports that 2 years earlier, Johnson ignored warnings from the security service when bestowing the title of nobility on the controversial son of the oligarch. And Johnson admits that in 2018, when he was Foreign Secretary, he deliberately left his bodyguards behind at a wild party in a villa of Lebedev in Italy. He may have violated safety rules. Met Police fines 126 for illegal Downing Street lockdown parties after conspicuously slow investigation, and Johnson has to pay a fine, as does Chancellor Sunak, today's Prime Minister. But Johnson sees no reason for resignation. And then we have May. After further delays, Sue Gray also publishes her report on the Downing Street parties. It describes 16 events and brings scandalous details to light. Inexplicably, however, she has not followed up on reports of parties at Johnson's official residence. The Prime Minister of the scandal holds a press conference in which he says he takes full responsibility for the revelations, but he still doesn't want to resign. And then we have June. Great Britain celebrates the Platinum Throne Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II with a big pump. She's 70 years in office. The 96-year-old can only be seen briefly at the celebrations and appears to be in poor health. Thousands of holidaymakers are stranded at the country's airports at the time. After the lockdowns, there is still a shortage of staff everywhere. Brexit makes it almost impossible for airport operators to recruit additional staff from abroad at short notice. For the first time, there's talk of Britain heading for a recession. The central bank is raising interest rates for the fifth time since December 2021 to 1.25%. And then we have July. Boris Johnson, who is finding it increasingly difficult to remain in office, is once again trying to use the Ukraine war for his own ends. At a 2-day reconstruction conference in Lugano in Switzerland, he is pushing ahead and trying to play a pioneering role, but it doesn't help. When dozens of ministers resigned a few days later after another Johnson scandal became known, he resigned from his post as Tory party leader. Ex-Chancellor of the Exchequer Rishi Sunak and Secretary of State Liz Truss advanced to the finals in the race to succeed him. And the climate crisis is also making itself felt this month. On July 19th, the thermometer rises to over 40 degrees in some parts of the country. That's a new record. At the end of the month, there was rare positive news. The English women's soccer team defeated Germany in the final of the European Women's Soccer Championship at Wembley Stadium. And then we have August. During the summer, the economic crisis spreads. The consumer price index rises to a 40-year high. The Bank of England seems to be increasingly haphazardly stumbling after developments and is raising interest rates to 1.75%. A further increase in energy prices to over £3,500 a year on average for a typical household threatens millions of low-income Britons. The government has no answer. The Prime Minister's office at Downing Street is in vacation mode. After resigning as Tory party leader in early July, Boris Johnson insisted that he remain in office until a successor was found. But instead of taking the initiative in his remaining time as Prime Minister and doing something about the skyrocketing prices, Johnson prefers to go on vacation, and twice in a row. It's not for nothing that the Prime Minister of the scandal has long been legendary for being work-shy. Instead, both the government and the Tory party are busy with themselves over the summer. In a week-long election campaign, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak are trying to present themselves as the most suitable candidates for the post of Tory party leader and Prime Minister. The extended election campaign in the midst of a crisis is also bizarre because it will not be the British public that will decide who moves to Downing Street. Only the approximately 172,000 Conservative Party members are called to vote. And most of them are of advanced age, male, white, well-off, extremely conservative, and deeply critical of the EU. So the vote is not particularly representative of British society. Sunak presents himself as a traditional conservative who wants to save. Truss causes a stir with exaggerated right-wing libertarian promises and the prospect of huge tax cuts. And then we have September. The Tory base opts for Liz Truss as expected. On September 6th, Queen Elizabeth II appoints her Prime Minister. The monarch died just 2 days later. The country enters a 10-day mourning period during which public lives come to a standstill. However, the head of state and government from all over the world travel to London and attend the state funeral. And Charles becomes king at the age of 73. After the end of the mourning period, the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kwasi Kwarteng, announced an unexpectedly radical tax cut package from which almost only the rich and companies should benefit. The idea is the tax cuts should trigger a trickle-down effect whereby an increase in wealth among the wealthy magically rains down on the rest of society. The banal idea has long since been disproved. The multi-billion tax gifts should also be financed on credit. Chaos erupted in the financial markets, pension funds threatened to collapse, and the country, and presumably the rest of the world, narrowly avoided catastrophe. Truss and Kwarteng's banal right-wing libertarian ideas, which have long been promoted by dubiously funded right-wing think tanks in London and Washington, are back where they belong, on the garbage heap of history. And then we have October. Prime Minister Truss initially seems unable to react to the chaos she has caused. When she finally intervenes, she rows back on almost every point and dismisses Chancellor Kwarteng. After only 45 days in office, Truss will resign. The Tory party spares the country another week-long voting procedure then. Former Chancellor of the Exchequer Rishi Sunak is named third Prime Minister of the year. A few weeks later, it is revealed that after parties, traces of cocaine have been discovered in Downing Street and at a country house that Truss used to use. After Sunak's appointment as Prime Minister, a noticeable sigh of relief goes through the country. Liz Truss' tenure as Prime Minister and the chaos that accompanied it faded from public consciousness with surprising speed. But hopes for an improvement in the situation are limited. After all, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, apart from the inevitable pandemic aid, Sunak has done little worth mentioning. The Tories are divided and paralyze themselves with endless infighting. And then we have November, December. We have to put those together. In his first few weeks in office, Sunak actually turned out to be an ineffective prime minister. He comes across as wooden and distant in his performances. The new Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, is taking back almost all of the announcements made during the over-the-top Truss era. Hunt sets up an advisory board that initially only consists of hedge fund managers and private equity experts. So BlackRock rules Britannia now? In Parliament, Sunak caved in at the first opportunity when around 100 MPs threatened an uprising when Sunak wanted to introduce binding targets for housing construction, because there is a serious housing shortage in Great Britain. Sunak withdrew his plans. A growing number of prominent Tory politicians are saying they will not run again in the future, and Labour shoots from pole high to pole high. And the scandals don't stop under Sunak either. Allegations of cronyism when placing orders for protective clothing at the beginning of the COVID pandemics are causing a stir. And former and current employees of Attorney General Dominic Raab are taking to the barricades accusing him of bullying. And there is no trace of Rishi Sunak here or there. The ex-banker and former hedge fund employee only shows initiative on one issue. Sunak recently announced controversial easing for the London financial sector. Among other things, rules that were enacted after the financial crash of 2007-2008 are to be rolled back in order to prevent another crisis. The country scraped past a full-fledged financial crisis just a few weeks ago. Unlike in the EU, bonuses for bankers should no longer be capped in the future. Critics fear that this could fuel excesses like those that led to the 2007 and 8 financial crisis. And the Bank of England raises interest rates to 3.5%. This is affecting millions of Britons whose mortgages have become significantly more expensive since the start of the year. The country is currently in a severe recession. Budget watchdogs from the Office for Budget Responsibility, or the OBR, recently certified the country's worst slump in living standards since records began. And the OECD assumes that the UK will end up at the bottom end of the G20 countries in terms of growth in the coming year, in 19th place, just ahead of Russia. And more workers are laying down their jobs to protest the drop in real wages, and the country descends into strikes at the end of the year. In December, nurses, ambulance crews, railway workers, government officials, airport workers and border guards, among others, went on strike. And what is Rishi Sunak's government doing? Declaring themselves not responsible, giving lectures on fighting inflation and attacking the allegedly militant unions. The fact that the situation is coming to such a head in Great Britain, of all places, has one main reason, and that is Brexit. More and more studies show how badly the exit from the EU has damaged the country economically. There is no remedy in sight in this regard, because Prime Minister Sunak is not only an avowed Brexit supporter. Given his weak position within his party and in the country, he also cannot afford to alienate the hardliners on the far right of his party. A recent attempt to make Sunak appear a little more down to earth also backfired. As Downing Street press staff put Sunak in an apron and placed him in a soup kitchen where he has to serve the food for the homeless in front of television cameras, the visibly uneasy Prime Minister asked the man present if he thought he could work in the financial sector. And the man replied, "I just want to make it over Christmas." The memorable exchange was viewed millions of times on social media. The opposition leans back and relaxes in the face of such blunders. According to recent polls, Labour would win such an election that the Tories would all but disappear as a political party. And with that, another miserable year in the UK comes to an end today. And of course, we must not forget, especially today, how the people in Ukraine are suffering from Russia's criminal war of aggression, and we must not let them disappear from the news. Let's all hope that 2023 finally has a lot of positives to offer. For the people of Ukraine, for the citizens of the UK, and for all of us, stay optimistic and stick to the facts. Happy New Year, and next year it still will be I'll be back.